So many remarkable things had to come together to allow this bear to return. Working together for 3 decades, most of the states of the European Union managed to see past the ancestral hostility to bears and restore them to these and other European landscapes. But the emergence of a new nature-hostile politics is now putting that remarkable achievement under threat. Not just in France, but across Europe.
You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. I'm your host, Jack Humphrey. In the Pyrenees, the native brown bear went extinct in 2004 when the last female cannelle was killed by a hunter. A reintroduced population of Slovenian bears has grown from just 3 to over 100, marking a dramatic if controversial comeback for one of Europe's most iconic animals. This success, however, has ignited a fierce culture war, pitting traditional livestock farmers against modern conservationists. This conflict, rooted in deep historical rebellion, has created a political stalemate that now prevents the release of new bears, trapping the population in a dangerous genetic bottleneck. In this second installment of his special Wolf Bear Lynx series for the Rewilding Earth podcast, Julius Purcell journeys into the heart of this conflict. He explores how the fight over the Pyrenean bear exposes the limits of European conservation, where deep-rooted traditions clash with the politics of rewilding, and where the future of this magnificent animal hangs in a delicate balance.
I'm 6,000 feet up in the Pyrenees, the mountains that separate France from Spain.
Alors, c'est l'heure de l'exercice.
Together with a small group of French nature lovers, I'm with Adrien Desrousseaux, who works for Pays de l'Ours, an organisation dedicated to protecting bears on the French side of these mountains. It's early May. It's been a really wet spring, with late snowfalls. The beech and hazel forests up here are a vivid lime green. Adrien is wielding a machete to clear the path. Adrien's saying that it's the first time anyone's been along here since last fall. Any humans, that is. Across these mountains, the brown bears emerged from their dens just a few weeks ago. Adrien's just shown us tufts of hair on the trees, and we've also seen other signs of their recent, magnificent presence here. The story of bears and humans in the Pyrenees is a very old one. In a cave not far from here are drawings of a bear made during the Upper Paleolithic 14,000 years ago.
The most noticeable thing is the hump on its shoulders, which is very characteristic of bears.
Steve Cracknell is a British author who spent many years writing about bears in the Pyrenees. This ancient drawing that Steve's describing connects us to a very contemporary drama that's playing out in these mountains.
It's not just a drawing of a bear, it appears to be the killing of a bear.
C'est dans cette zone de falaise qu'a été récupérée la dépouille de cannelle.
The last female bear of the subspecies Ursus arctos pyrenaicus, a descendant of this bear depicted in the drawing, was killed by a hunter on November the 1st, 2004. Named Cannelle, she was the last of her kind in France.
C'est la fin d'une race.
The death of Cannelle was not, however, the death of bears in the Pyrenees, because some years before Cannelle was killed, bears from another subspecies had been introduced into the mountains from Eastern Europe. In the last 28 years, that population has grown from 3 to over 100. But the presence of these bears has been bitterly resisted by livestock farmers, triggering a dramatic culture war across these mountains.
C'est fini les pétards, hein? C'est fini les fusées, les pancartes. On va passer à autre chose.
In this episode, I'll be looking at how the Pyrenean culture war is preventing attempts to stabilise and genetically diversify the new bear population. How this exposes the limitations of European nature restoration when it comes into conflict with traditions and a deep-rooted cultural hostility to wildness. This is the funeral mass in 1996 of François Mitterrand. A fighter as a young man against Nazi occupation and later a staunch believer in the European Union, Mitterrand was France's longest-serving president. Conservationists remember him for two reasons. Firstly, for eating a dish of endangered songbirds just before he died, and secondly, rather more positively, all through his presidency, Mitterrand vowed to restore France's population of bears. A few months after his death, his wish was fulfilled. Now, at this moment in 1996, Canel, the native Pyrenean bear, was still roaming the mountains. As explained earlier, ecologists knew that this native subspecies had fallen to such low numbers that it had basically become unviable. So they recommended a Slovenian subspecies, a very close match, be introduced into the mountains here. In May 1996, two female bears were transferred from Slovenia to the French Pyrenees. A male Slovenian bear was transferred to France a year later. His name was Pyros. The sound you're hearing is Pyros's release in the spring of 1997. The release box opens and Pyros barrels out. He's off before the waiting cameras and merges with the forest. As we saw with the recolonization of Germany by wolves from the last episode, the story of the restoration of bears in the French Pyrenees and the story of their future is intertwined with wider European politics. Let's go back to the year 1992. For the political leaders gathered to see the torch lit at the Olympics in Barcelona that summer, there's a general feeling of hope. The Western states that make up the European community are about to rename themselves as the European Union. Italia. And with the Soviet menace over, its leaders can turn to new challenges, to take measures against climate change and the destruction of nature. 1992 is the year that Europe passed the European Union's Habitats Directive. Europe's record on nature is complicated. Many conservationists argue that the European Union's agricultural policies has contributed to the decline of biodiversity in general, bugs, birds, and wildflowers. Even so, the Habitats Directive remains the legal basis on which the European Union, working with its member states, have enabled the dramatic return of lynxes, bears, and wolves. The Habitats Directive placed the brown bear in the species grouping with the highest protection. All very well in theory, but the European Union has always had to strike a delicate balance between European and local sensibilities, the stick of legal action with the carrot of subsidies. The deal is this: restore nature, get money for rural communities. As we examined in the last episode on wolves, the EU's rural interventions are not always welcome on the ground. And in the French Pyrenees, bears have met furious resistance from livestock farmers. In 2017, when the Slovenian bear population had reached nearly 50 individuals, anti-bear protests erupted. Steve Cracknell explains what happened.
A bear attacked a flock in high Ariège and Montrouge. It killed one, the rest panicked, and they tried to escape down a slope which was far too steep for them, and they tumbled to their deaths. And 209 sheep died, and you can imagine they had about 800 sheep. They lost 200 in one sole event. They were very angry.
Videos from the time show shepherds flinging buckets of sheep's blood at public buildings. Enough of bangers and placards and slogans, the man's shouting. It's time to try other methods. These feelings have deep historical roots in the central Pyrenees, which is called the Ariège.
The Ariège was obviously very isolated from the rest of France.
In the early 1800s, the French state passed laws restricting access of local shepherds to the
which was very
forests.
important to them. And so you have around 1828 what was called la guerre des demoiselles, where there were insurrections which included attacking any symbol of authority, and there were a few deaths as well until the army was brought in. The shepherds had the advantage of knowing the land very well, so they could do their attack and disappear into the nature, and nobody would be able to capture them. So that's part of the Ariège tradition of rebellion against the state, and that tradition is still well known in the area.
Stop! Ça suffit! L'État français met en place une gestion du territoire.
During the 2017 protests, a sensational video was released to social media, which shows a group of men masked in balaclavas. Wielding rifles in booming tones, these Ariégeois shepherds are threatening the same French state on which their forefathers had declared war 200 years ago.
Shepherds, hikers, hunters. We have decided to resume hunting bears in the Ariège.
Now, as brown bears have the status of highly protected under the Habitats Directive, it's illegal to harm them under any circumstances. But since the death of Canel, several bears have been killed. In 2020, on the Spanish side of the border, Cashew was allegedly poisoned. Arrests have been made for Cashew's death and a trial is pending. That same year, Ursus was shot by a Spanish hunter and Gribouille by a French hunter.
Si je parle trop vite, vous me le dites.
Most herders, of course, don't harbour such violent views. Shepherd Marguerite Bro, for example. It's a crisp November morning in the foothills of the Pyrenees, not far from Carcassonne. There's breakfast laid out on the tailgate of Marguerite's truck. Around us, the piney limestone ridges plunge into valleys filled with vines and cypress trees. Marguerite's flock winters here. Under compensation rules set by the European Union, shepherds must protect their flocks with temporary fences and guard dogs. If these measures are in place, the state will compensate, theoretically, any loss from bears. Marguerite's guard dogs are Pyrenean mountain dogs, known locally as patous. They're powerful animals, standing 31 inches high. But even a big patou can be intimidated by a bear, especially when it's attacking, and shepherds frequently complain that the fences often don't work either. As for compensation, Marguerite's explaining that it has to be decided by a commission. They ascertain if an attack can be attributed to a bear. Marguerite has direct experience of this because last July, high up in the Pyrenean summer pasture to the south of here, a bear attacked.
Those lambs used to come into the cabin. I was their mother. And then to find them killed, it's hard. We love our animals.
Ecologists are fully aware of the inconvenience of bears to livestock farmers, but they believe that if there is willingness by herders to take advantage of the preventative measures on offer, problems can be resolved, and bears and flocks can cohabit. But there's a lot of misinformation doing the rounds among rural communities and livestock farmers. It's often heard that Slovenian bears are more aggressive than the native Pyrenean bears, or that they're sort of carnivores in disguise and don't really subsist on seeds and berries. Neither of these assertions are true. Alain Rennes is president of the organisation Pays de l'Ours, dedicated to defending bears in the Pyrenees. He accuses the livestock farming lobby of distorting the narrative in other ways too.
Livestock farming in the Pyrenees is not threatened by bears. The reverse is true. Shepherding communities have actually been saved by state and EU nature subsidies since the turn of the century. Thanks to this money, which is tied to restoring bear numbers, shepherds can employ 600 assistants in the summer months.
En fait, plus ils s'opposent, plus ils obtiennent des moyens.
But the more they oppose bears, the more financial help they get. There's jobs for shepherds, a lot of money to finance cabins, and the damage has decreased. Today, I have to say cohabitation with bears is a minor problem.
But the more bears there are, surely the more attacks on livestock. Alain Rennes insists that this isn't true.
Elles se suivent pas du tout.
Greater bear numbers do not have to lead to more attacks. The maximum damage in the Pyrenees was in 2019. There were 52 bears then. Today, there are over 100 bears, and there's 3 times less damage than in 2019. Why? Because the state has funded protection measures. These measures are very effective.
A 2023 report commissioned by the French government compared the impact of bears in the French Pyrenees with that of bear populations in Spain and Italy. The political and social tension in the French Pyrenees was much higher than those other areas, and those other areas also suffered fewer bear attacks on livestock compared to France. So there are rural communities that managed to cohabit with bears. The problem is that the media rarely show this. Angry shepherds throwing sheep's blood is a better story than people just quietly working out ways of sharing their landscape with wild animals. And the media rarely mentions subsidies. A principal beneficiary of state and EU subsidies related to bears in the French Pyrenees is the livestock sector itself. This works out to about 12 million euros, $14 million a year. A fair chunk of that money funds shepherd assistant jobs. And let's look at the significant ecological benefits that these plantigrades offer these mountains. Firstly, the ecology of fear, in which the presence of bears disperses herbivores such as deer through the landscape, preventing overgrazing and allowing vegetation to regenerate. Steve Cracknell.
The other effect of bears is, of course, that they eat seeds and they're good walkers, so they will distribute them somewhere else. They will have seeds in their fur which will drop elsewhere. So they do have an ecological effect. It's just that at present, with the small numbers that we have, that effect is so far limited.
But it's not just the numbers of bears across the mountain chain. The big worry is the genetic variation within that population. Remember Pyros, the sound of whose release in 1997 we heard earlier.
There has been one dominant bear, Pyros, over a period of 25 years until he died at a quite respectable age of nearly 30. He mated with his daughters and his granddaughters, and to the extent that 75% of Pyrenean bears and more were directly related to him. There's far too much inbreeding, and that is a threat to the long-term survival of bears in the Pyrenees.
How do you increase the genetic viability? Well, you release more bears. But if you release more bears, you anger the farmers, especially in the Ariège. The French state is required by law to protect and expand its bear population. The Pyrenean bear issue sometimes reaches top-tier politics. In March 2018, there was a landmark ruling that found that the French state was neglecting its duty to bears. In a gesture to show that France took it seriously, French President Emmanuel Macron agreed to the release of 2 more Slovenian bears that year. But the optimism didn't last. In 2021, the French government was about to unveil funding plans for new measures to protect livestock. In parallel, it was hoped with new bear releases. At the last minute, regional politicians pulled the plug on the plan. So at present, in 2025, there are no plans for future bear releases. I asked for an interview with the French Office of Biodiversity, but they refused. Pro-bear organisations fear that lobbying pressure by farmers has forced France into a situation that satisfies nobody. Bears hanging on in these mountains, genetically impoverished, and with no prospect of reaching the numbers needed for a cascade of ecological renewal. It's February in the eastern Pyrenees. Every Sunday of this month, a different town in this region hosts its version of the Fête de l'Ours, the festival of the bear. This Sunday, it's the turn of Sant Llorenç de Cerdans. The tiny French town is packed, swelled by Catalan and Spanish speakers who have just come from over the border. Música! According to the story, the bear stirs from his winter sleep on February the 2nd, which is of course Groundhog Day in the United States. Now this is no coincidence. February the 2nd is the Christian feast of Candlemas, when the child Jesus is presented in the temple. Falling exactly 40 days after Christmas, it gave rise to a slew of popular festivals across Europe in which awakening animals symbolize the stirrings of springtime and desire. We're being chased by the bear, they're saying. They seem pretty happy about it. The bear at Sant Llorenç is always played by a man in his 20s, from the village. The bear head and skin that he wears is realistic and fierce. There's nothing Disneyish about this. The bear runs amok in the crowd. He attacks women. He's captured. There's this kind of harangue, and the crowd boo. And then he escapes again and is recaptured. These women have just come up to me and rubbed my face with handfuls of glitter. Dressed in tiny little tutus, they're the figuretas, or little figs. Andrea has just come over the border from Spain. It's about what she calls the vital force of the bear. Like many other popular European festivals, transgression is given a free rein for one afternoon and then order returns. That's the moral. The bear of disorder can run amok for a while, but is always captured or killed eventually. The reintroduced bear population of the Ariège is way to the west of here. Bears disappeared from this part of the eastern Pyrenees long ago. Some here today, like Thibault in his 30s, see the irony of this. To Thibault, bears belong in these mountains. And he'd be happy for them to return. Order versus disorder, humans versus bears. This old festival reflects some old binaries. On the other hand, as Steve Cracknell has argued, it does show a cultural baseline for bears exists here. So one day perhaps the festival can celebrate the bear as order, the natural order, and every bit as fierce and awesome and fun.
That's amazing. Wow. More snow on there since yesterday, is that possible?
I don't know what the groundhog-style predictions for the Pyrenees were back in February. Snow lingered on the high peaks, and that's why it wasn't until May that Adrien of the organisation Pays de l'Ours gave his go-ahead for the first bear tracking trip of the year.
Julius.
Bonjour. The Pyrenean French village we set out from is called Mel. It's a consequential place in our story. The area has a strong livestock tradition, and it was here in Mel that the bear Pyros, that descendant of so many of the current Pyrenean bear population, was released back in 1997. Bears are celebrated in the village's official signage, but on the approach road we see anti-bear graffiti.
Moi je le sais ce qu'on va faire. Le reportage, je vous l'écris.
Adrien is fed up with the way journalists come in, present the bear situation as this sterile binary, and then move on. The anti-bears say, "Oh, it's not possible, we don't like bears here." And then we have an ecologist who comes along and says, "Oh, we love bears." Conclusion? Cohabitation is hard in the Pyrenees between bears and people. Well, that's hardly news. Let's move beyond this, he's saying. Let's ask the fundamental questions. What is a bear? What are the solutions to live with that bear? That's what we do. We'll tell you what a bear is and how to live with him. That's constructive. And so, after a discussion about whether chaffinches can predict the weather, we head up to the high slopes, up incredibly steep paths.
C'est le zig de la muerte.
The zigzag of death, as Adrien reassuringly calls it. Far below us, the young River Garonne flows out of Spain in a roar of snowmelt. Now that we're high up in these beech woods, it's a relief after all these arguments and statistics to finally be in bear country. The tufts of hair that we find on the trees are collected and put into envelopes. They'll be sent to the labs for DNA testing so that the bear's movements can be tracked and better understood. And as I said at the beginning of the episode, we're the first people that have been along here since last fall. The camera trap has a video of an adult male bear that passed along this path just a week ago. The gasp we all let out reflects, I think, a really basic emotion, that he was here, right here, on this spot. As he rears up, high on his back legs to scratch against the tree, we all sense his magnificence, the rightness of him being here. So many remarkable things had to come together to allow this bear to return. Working together for 3 decades, most of the states of the European Union managed to see past the ancestral hostility to bears and restore them to these and other European landscapes. But the emergence of a new nature-hostile politics is now putting that remarkable achievement under threat. Not just in France, but across Europe, bears face culls as populist politics finds its voice. A cull of hundreds of bears, for example, has already been launched by Slovakia. At the same time, there are reasonable signs of hope. Polling across France shows pretty solid public support for the reintroduction of bears. Although this support drops within Pyrenean communities, it's still a majority view, which comes as a surprise to those who only see the lurid accounts in the media of shepherd-bear culture wars.
I learned few things today, few things very interesting.
And just as we saw in the episode on wolves in Germany, there have now been 3 decades of bear realities here on the France-Spain border. Anyone born in the early 1990s or later has grown up knowing that bears now dwell in these forests.
I am 32 years old.
On the way down the mountain, I talked to Amandine, a young hospital psychologist who lives about 50 miles away.
I came with my boyfriend. It was a gift for us from my family.
Ah, lovely.
Because we love hiking and animals. For me, bears are a part of the mountains. I can't imagine mountains without bears.
At the beginning of this episode, I explained how the bear Canel, killed in 2004, was the last reproductive female of the subspecies Ursus arctos pyrenaicus, but she was only the last in France. Although the Pyrenees end at the Atlantic, its geology continues, a chain of mountains that forms the green, rocky brow of Spain's northern seaboard. These are known as the Cantabrian Mountains, and here's the twist. Amid the noise of the bear debate in the Pyrenees, in the Cantabrian Mountains just next door, which has a strong dairy and livestock tradition, Ursus arctos pyrenaicus has survived, and its population is doing pretty well. Now, we've heard how the bears of the Pyrenees, who have inflamed passions and obsessed the media for 2 decades, now number 100. In a 2023 census which surveyed a swathe of northern Spain, the Cantabrian bear population was estimated to be over 350. So are the Spanish more tolerant of bears? That's a bit too simplistic, because on the Spanish side of the Pyrenees, there's often the same hostility to bears as on the French side. Bear tolerance seems to be a phenomenon specific to the Cantabrian region. Now, coexistence there is not perfect, and there's some social tension. But media coverage in the Cantabrian region is often sympathetic to bears, and Pyrenaicus bears are seen as a plus for local tourism. These are young musicians from the village of Cangas de Narcea, deep in the range of the Cantabrian bear. This is a region with farming traditions every bit as strong as the Pyrenees. As we see time and again, toleration of wildness seems to come down to memory baselines. Pyrenean livestock farmers had got used to living without bears for generations. Although Cantabrian bears fell to a critical low 40 years ago, they never entirely went away. So do local people see them as an inconvenience? Of course they do. But they also see them as a part of life and the landscape. Restoring wildness is about biology and ecology, but it's also about the story that we tell ourselves. Wildness as disorder, or wildness as the highest order in an otherwise degraded world. Perhaps, as Amandine and her generation grow older, they can start reframing that story in the Pyrenees, where the first brown bears arrived long before we did, 250,000 years ago.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you don't miss the next episode in the Wolf Bear Lynx series. Subscribe to the Rewilding Institute's weekly digest and this podcast at rewilding.org/subscribe. Please consider making a donation at rewilding.org/donate if you're a fan of the podcast. And be sure to share this episode with friends. Thanks.